Hello. So, I've had a lot of first dates, and sometimes many of those dates have ended up being with people who turned out to be kind of emotionally abusive, and a lot of them have turned out to be with people who were actually pretty cool and we got along great. And I wanted to share with you today some of the warning signs or red flags I've learned to notice early on in dating that someone could end up being abusive, so that you don't end up having to deal with that like yourself. But before I get into the specific signs, I want to take you into the mind of an abuser. And I'm mostly going to be talking about emotional abuse here, and the reason for that is usually physical abuse starts off by being emotional abuse and then it escalates into physical abuse. However, if you're at the point in your relationship that you're experiencing any kind of physical abuse, I would just like to say that is very serious. I really hope that you take that seriously. It is out of the scope of this video, but I am going to put some links to resources in the description, so I would hope you would go check those out. But kind of coming back to getting inside the head a little bit of people who behave abusively, we can kind of start with the question, like, why are some people abusive? And I'll be honest with you, I've been thinking about this question for years, and I've never really come up with like a satisfying reason for why people end up being abusive. But I have kind of come up with a way of sort of thinking about how they operate. I think that maybe the best way to sort of describe that would be to think of an analogy. The way that abusive people often feel about their partners is very similar to the way normal people feel about something like their car. And what I mean by that is, I guess we could talk about people who are abusive tend to objectify their partners, but that language is very abstract. So if we kind of boil down into it, let's say you need your car to go to work. You rely on your car to go to work, right? Now, let's say someone steals your car. How do you feel? You probably feel angry. You probably feel scared or nervous, like you don't know how you're going to get to work anymore. The person who stole the car, you may want to get revenge on them, or you may want them to be punished. You may have that sort of frustration there. These are kind of, in our culture, very normal emotions that might come up if someone stole your car. But for an abusive person, one of the similarities is that they do end up relying on their partner, and most of us rely on our partners. However, the difference is that to an abuser, your personal agency feels the same way that the car thief feels to a normal person. Let's say you don't want to do something that your abuser wants you to do. You are now preventing the abuser from getting something that they want from you, and they view your personal agency as a villain, as an obstacle, as something to be overcome, and they kind of view it as something they have the right to retaliate against. The abuser feels like your personal agency is taking from them something that they need and something they deserve to have. One of the best ways of dealing with an abuser is not to date one and to leave them as early as possible in the relationship. Abuse tends to escalate over time, and so the earlier you can get out of an abusive situation, the better. So then what are some of the really early stage signs, possibly even first date, or some of these are even pre-first date signs that we can talk about? The number one sign is if this person invalidates your fears or concerns. And so if they try to take a condescending tone, or they try to talk you out of your fears, that is a sign that they view your fears as an obstacle to what they want, and they're just trying to get around them, not that they are trying to connect with you as a person or understand you. Here's an example from my own personal life. I had matched with a guy on Tinder during the COVID pandemic, before we had vaccines, and he was trying to get me to come and hang out with him and watch a movie at his place. And he said to me that, I just hung out with a friend of mine who is a doctor, and so I thought that because they were a doctor, they might be high risk of COVID. And I said, well, if you just hung out with your doctor friend, should we wait a few days before we hang out? And he said, oh, no, it's fine. I took a test and I came back negative. And I said, well, I thought the tests took a few days to be valid. And he's like, no, that's not true. They're valid immediately. And I said, are you sure? How does that work? Is there a new kind of test or something? That's not what I understood. And he said, well, why don't you come over and I will explain it to you? And it was really condescending, like he knew better than me, like he understood the test better than me. But then on top of that, for me to get the full explanation for him, I had to give him what he wanted. I had to go and see him in person before he was willing to explain mysteriously how he had these magic tests that worked immediately after exposure, right? And I mean, I didn't go see him. I told him I wasn't going, and then he got upset with me and canceled communications. But for me, that was a huge red flag. I think I had a legitimate concern. I think I pointed out accurately that what he was telling me was incorrect. And then he took this very superior, condescending approach, talking down to me as if he knew better, as if he was some sort of expert on the matter, like I was a sort of child or something. And I didn't like that, so I bailed on it. But if you ever see someone who is invalidating you, invalidating your concerns, especially if they are taking on an unearned position of authority, that can be a very big red flag. So number 2 is if people do not respect your sexual boundaries. You know, in a way, this one is kind of obvious, but it is also a situation that a lot of us find ourselves in, you know, kind of regularly. Personally, right now, it hasn't been so much of an issue lately, and part of the reason is I actually have a history of sexual assault. So I tell people pretty early, I'm like, hey, like if you want to be physical very fast, I'm not going to be able to do that. So you might want to find someone else. And honestly, for me, that's actually been a really good strategy of avoiding sexually coercive people. However, I don't think it's a strategy that everyone wants or is going to work for everyone. And so what I would say is if you're in a sexual situation with someone and they keep pushing your bounds, or you keep trying to say no, or even if you're not trying to like say no, if you're just trying to cool it down or asking to slow down and they're not hearing you about wanting to slow down, that's a really big red flag. Even though I don't date sexually coercive people anymore, it has been a thing that's happened to me in the past. And one little piece of advice I would have, if you're in a situation, someone's pressuring you and you don't know how to get out of it, go to the bathroom. Sounds silly, but just say you got to go to the bathroom, lock yourself in the bathroom for 5-10 minutes, and this has a few benefits. A, it gives the other person time to cool down. You know, it gives them time so that they're not as feverish as they were. And second of all, you can pretend to be sick. Just pretend you had like the worst diarrhea, apologize to them, say you're so embarrassed, and get out of there. You can even call your Uber or Lyft in the bathroom or whatever, right? And it, you know, it sounds dumb, but just putting space between yourself and that other person is really useful. And like, you'd have to be a real big jerk to not let someone go to the bathroom, right? Like you might pee all over their bed. So if you're really feeling pressured sexually and you don't know what to do, just create space somehow, anyhow. Use the bathroom trick if you can't think of anything else. The third warning sign is if people end up dropping hints that you're not good enough or they're going to help you improve in some way. So a story from my own dating life is I was just messaging with a guy back and forth on Tinder, and he asks me, what kind of risks are you taking right now? And I found the question kind of annoying, so I was just like, you know, it's COVID, I'm trying not to take risks or something, a little snarky like that. And then he goes back and he's like, oh, we're going to have to work on that. And I was like, okay, that's weird, but I'll roll with it for a minute because we're just texting. And then, you know, like a few texts later or whatever, you know, he said that same line again. That's something we're going to have to work on. Like one of my behaviors was something we're going to have to work on. And I was just like, hey, bro, do you always try to change the women you're dating? And after that, the conversation got awkward and it kind of rolled down. But for me, that was a big red flag. If someone is trying to change you, to kind of go back to the car analogy, like they feel entitled over you. And so if I have my own car, I can put bumper stickers on it, I can change the paint job, whatever. I'm totally free to do that. But if someone is indicating they're having those same kind of feelings for me, like they feel like the things about me are available for them to tweak or improve on, it's a kind of a sign they're looking for something to like extend their own ego. They're not really looking to explore another human. And often the way this one will sort of present itself, it will present itself as someone doing you a favor, right? Like this guy, and maybe he even thought that, like, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to help you become a better person. Aren't you so grateful? No, I wasn't. So don't be taken in by it. Don't be taken in by this false idea that someone's helping you improve. If it's not something that you've asked for directly, it's actually kind of controlling behavior, and I would view it as an early warning sign of someone who might end up being manipulative or abusive. So number 4. Number 4 is a little bit of a nuanced one. Is someone able to have a productive conversation around jealousy? It's nuanced because jealousy comes up in many relationships. It's fairly common, and so it's not in and of itself necessarily a warning sign, But it's also something you really have to pay attention to because it is a major factor in extreme abuse. For women who end up being killed by their partners, jealousy is a major factor in their relationship. I think something like the vast majority of the time, like 80 or 90% of the time. And so on the one hand, it's kind of common, but on the other hand, you can't ignore it. And so what I would really look for when dealing with jealousy is somebody able to work with you on jealousy? And do they say things like, hey, I'm feeling a lot of jealousy. Can you work with me to help me find a solution that will help ratchet down my jealousy? I think that's a fairly productive way to work with jealousy. However, if they're making like demands of you, if they're saying you can't see your friends, you can't see your family, you can't go to work because they feel so jealous, that is toxic jealousy, and you need to be very, very careful. And so what you need to look for early on, if someone starts experiencing jealousy, are they looking to work with you, or are they making demands of you? Even if those demands seem very small or reasonable at first, like, hey, I don't want you to talk to your ex, if this is something that they demand and they haven't workshopped with you first, it is a red flag. Like all kinds of abuse, jealousy has a tendency to escalate over the relationship. So if early on in a relationship you're having mild problems with toxic jealousy, with demands out of jealousy, then that problem is not going to get better if you give into it. In fact, that problem is very likely to get worse. And if someone cannot transform their toxic jealousy into productive jealousy, if they cannot transform their demands into basically workshopping with you, that's bad. And I mean, I would probably leave someone in that situation, but I would recommend taking it very seriously. And then the final warning sign I highlighted today was, do they demonstrate any anger or rage early in the relationship? Again, this is one of those ones that is likely to escalate over time. You have to be very sensitive to early exhibitions of anger. You can't compare early levels of anger that you've experienced in a relationship with later levels of anger. So an example of this that happened for me on Tinder, this was actually pre-date, was he messaged me after we matched in the morning before I got into work. I kind of noticed it, but I was working all day, so I just put it aside. And then I was going to go after work and get back to him. And he had messaged me again. And he's like, why didn't you message me all day? And I responded, I was like, sorry, I was at work. And he's like, you couldn't even find like 20 minutes or like a minute to just quickly respond. And I unmatched him, and I took that as a big red flag. The reason I was really put off by that is someone feeling entitled to my time that early after all we had done was a Tinder match. If he's already getting snippy with me before we've even met, like how much worse would he be if we were like 2 years into a relationship and we're having trouble making the rent, right? Like that is someone who is having a lot of trouble controlling their anger and frustration. Any little signs of anger, even if they don't seem that bad, early on they count for more than later in the relationship. And when we're talking about escalating behavior in a relationship, it's also important to note it's not necessarily like a steady escalation over time. What it can be is a sudden escalation after a commitment point in the relationship. And what I mean by commitment point is basically any time you and your partner commit to each other in a way that makes it harder for you to leave the relationship, abusive behavior can get worse. So examples of this are if you move in together, if you get engaged, if you get married, or if you have a baby. Every single one of those behaviors means you have both committed to the relationship a little more, and it would be worse to get out of the relationship than if you hadn't done that. And what can happen is people can sort of be on their best behavior, and then they kind of feel safe or that the relationship's not going anywhere, and then they're kind of angrier, nastier side comes out a bit. And so I think that one thing you want to be really mindful of in a relationship is watching after you get past these particular points. Is someone treating you worse? If you move in together or something, and then right after you move in together, someone starts being mean to you, I would investigate that, because that might not be an anomaly. That might be an escalating abusive behavior that is happening because your relationship has become more committed. If you notice that, you might want to be starting to thinking about a plan of what you would do if this doesn't turn out to be an anomaly, if this does turn out to be regular abusive behavior. How are you going to handle that situation? Because again, with all of this, the earlier you catch that someone is abusive and the earlier you respond to it, the safer it's going to be for you, the less dangerous it's going to be. In particular, the less your partner relies on you, the safer you are getting out of the relationship. This might seem a little bit weird, but to go back to the car again, imagine you had a car, and imagine you need to have that car to make a living, like you're a traveling salesperson or something, and you need your car, and without that car you can't make any money. Imagine how angry you're going to be if that car is stolen. But now imagine that you have some old beat up car that like you like, but you take the subway to work every day, and it's annoying if the car gets stolen, but it's not going to freak you out the same way as if your livelihood is dependent on your car, right? And so in a similar way, when you're trying to get out of an abusive relationship, the less that abusive person feels like they need you, the easier it's going to be for you to get out. And again, as relationships progress, we tend to need each other more. So just trying to get out of abusive situations as early as possible, not ignoring the warning signs. If you're a little on the fence or you're worried someone might get more abusive, but you can't quite tell, don't let them rely on you. Try to get your partner to become more self-reliant if you possibly can. Try to get them to hang out with their own friends, those types of things, if it's at all possible. Honestly, in general, if you're dealing with any sort of anywhere serious abuse, really the only out is to leave. And if you're worried about that, I would highly encourage thinking about leaving. But anyway, I know this is kind of a depressing topic, but what's nice is particularly if you start rejecting people early or getting out of abusive relationships early, that actually frees up a lot of your time to make connections with good people. This sounds a bit harsh, but I am definitely someone who errs on the side of cutting people early if they exhibit any sort of warning sign like this. I feel like I feel really happy with how my dating life has progressed. I feel like I end up just spending more time with people who are kind, with people who are nice to me and treat me with respect. I would encourage people to, if you think someone might be abusive, like you don't owe them anything, like get out of there before it gets worse. Anyway, those are my 2 cents. Thanks for watching. Bye.